let's go.
So I'll
Let's
get
go with
started.
that.
Okay. My topic is about baseball, early baseball and fans, and it's a fascinating topic to me. And it's a subtle thing because any new phenomenon, the problem with trying to figure out how it started is that it's new and people aren't sure what it is always, and they often don't have a name for it. So over the years, I've kept a growing file at every mention of crowds and crowd behavior, trying to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and see what developments, evolution, and changes there are in who watched a game, how many people, and the character of the crowds. And this is what I'm going to talk about now. But to begin, I'll ask a question. What distinguishes a casual game from a modern sport? Among the possible answers, you might say statistics, media coverage, standardized rules, a governing body. But the most indispensable of all is fans. After all, if no one's watching, then no one's buying tickets, no one's reading box scores or game stories, not to mention that no one will be paid. So when and where did the phenomenon of the baseball fan actually happen? A sports fan isn't just a spectator. There's a difference. A burning building attracts spectators. A sports fan is someone who follows an athlete or a team without a material interest, such as a wager, and for no reason other than voluntary emotional commitment. The key is that he identifies with the team or athlete he's rooting for. Their victories are his victories, and the same is true of their losses. It's a very commonplace phenomenon for us today, but one that didn't always exist. In the beginning, there were no baseball fans. Baseball, when it started, even as an adult sport, even when it was getting organized, was something people did, not something they watched. And they did it almost exclusively, of course, in and around New York City. Now, baseball has a long history as a participant sport, longer than we know, again, with no evidence that there were any fans. How long? We just don't know. We don't know because casual games that nobody watches or follows are not normally covered in the newspaper. Baseball clubs begin to appear on the historical radar and occasionally in the news in the 1840s and 50s. The period before that was baseball's dark ages. Adult baseball was happening, but we have almost zero information about it, who played where and how. This image is an 1827 illustration of City Hall Park. Now we have bits and pieces of evidence of early informal games in downtown open spaces. This is City Hall Park in Lower Manhattan, which still exists. City Hall Park was a playground for, among other things, boys and young men who worked for printers. Nassau Street, which is very close to City Hall Park, was the center of the publishing district. And it's easy to imagine, and it's not implausible, that some of the boys in this 1827 print might have grown up to become members of the Eagle Club, one of the early, best-known New York clubs of the early days that was made up of journalists, printers, editors, and publishers who worked on Nassau Street. Who knows? One of them might have been Thomas Fitzgerald. He was apprenticed at a very young age to a publisher in New York City. This is the man who, in his 20s, moved to Philadelphia, became a millionaire publisher, and was instrumental in convincing Philadelphians to switch from town ball to the New York game. Are scenes like this in this picture a clue to why journalists so energetically promoted baseball in the pre-Civil War years? Perhaps. As they ran out of space and City Hall Park was encroached upon and landscaped, New York City's baseball scene moved. It relocated to Chatham Square in what's now Manhattan's Chinatown. Pickup games there were the matrix of the well-known Gotham, Washington, New York, and Knickerbocker clubs. And as Lower Manhattan grew continually denser, these clubs relocated again farther uptown to Madison Square and parts north, then to Hoboken in New Jersey. But still, through the 1840s, there was very little press coverage and really no evidence of significant public interest, certainly nothing resembling fans. Into the 1850s, there was in fact no word for fans. There were no stands or facilities for fans. There were no press stories about traffic jams or fan behavior or anything resembling fan behavior. Then came the Elysian Fields period, when New York City's principal baseball clubs crossed the Hudson and the Hoboken Ferry. And this period lasted about a decade, from the mid-40s to the mid-50s, from the founding of the Knickerbocker Club to the founding of the first New York-style baseball clubs in Brooklyn. What we have here, this is from Peverelli's 1866 book, American Pastimes, and therefore it's a little bit of a look backward. It's a picture of how they imagined baseball games being played in the Elysian Fields at an earlier period. And it's an interesting picture because it's a bit nostalgic and romanticized. It almost smacks of advertising. Note the stylish looking gentleman. In the distance, you have the well-dressed women in the shade next to the building down the right side of the picture. This portrait it's a rosy picture of early baseball, but I think it's designed to complement baseball's effort to market itself to the respectable Protestant prosperous classes. Now, during this Elysian Fields period we're talking about, there was increasing press coverage, and there are smatterings of reports of small crowds that seem to be made up principally of ball players, their friends, their family, and sometimes gamblers. We can also detect the first signs of the media promoting baseball. News stories that note or likely exaggerate how many women came to the game. You know, the first couple of times you read a story that says that there were many ladies at the game, you believe it, but the 100th time you begin to realize it's boilerplate. It's designed to attract young men to the game, and also as evidence of the game's respectability. During the Elysian Fields, there are vague suggestions that spectator interest may be growing, but you have to be skeptical because, as we know, the newspapers are promoting the game, and you almost never see a hard number or even a numerical estimate, which to me is a bit suspicious. Something else is missing. There is little to no indication of interclub or intercity rivalry. In 1845, there was a Brooklyn versus New York series that completely failed to attract significant public interest, certainly no fans, and was quickly forgotten about. Our next picture is something that's probably considerably more realistic than the picture in the Peverelli book. This is a picture of an actual game on the Elysian Fields, the Magnolia Baseball Club playing in 1843. And we can learn something from this game besides the fact that they may have used stakes instead of bases. There's nobody watching it at all. Certainly no facilities at all, and no space for spectators. Those people by the scoring table are players and a couple of scorers, perhaps. The Colonnade Hotel that you see in the picture had changing rooms for baseball clubs, but it's not a concession for fans in any way. Baseball in the Hoboken period, the Elysian Fields period, was a bit like a potted plant. The game survived, but it didn't really advance or flourish. There was very little evolutionary progress. It was, in a sense, on exhibit, like the other causes, steam engines, railroads, ferries, that were championed by the Stevens family, the owners of the Elysian Fields, and most of the rest of Hoboken. The Knickerbockers and their ilk played almost all of their games intramurally. From 1845 through 1850, the Knicks played about 200 games, 3 against other clubs. Even the most ardently pro-baseball journalists cannot make an intramural game newsworthy. The Elysian Fields clubs were playing for themselves, not for their city or communities, and this stunted their appeal as entertainment. Here's another picture of a game in the Elysian Fields from Harpers Weekly in 1859. And it's interesting, there are very few spectators, there are some, but they seem to be, there's something casual about them. In the distance, of course, there's the women, and there's perhaps some friends and family. There's no more than a couple dozen people over here. And on the background, these people in the carriages might as well be people driving through the Elysian Fields who stopped to look. There's certainly no indication of something you could call fan behavior. You notice there's no restraining ropes for crowds. Game stories from this period often mention spectators, but again, no concrete numbers or estimates. And they sometimes describe the crowd as made up of gamblers or baseball insiders. Phrases like members of the sporting fraternity or connoisseurs of the game or outside friends. As I said before, there's no spectator infrastructure, there's no stands, there's no concessions, there's no bathrooms. There's no evidence of anything, and no news stories mention any problems with crowd behavior, rowdiness, crowd control measures. In 1854, the first Brooklyn team, the Excelsiors, are formed on the New York City model, and obviously many others quickly followed. Baseball was replanted in more fertile soil in Brooklyn, where it quickly flourished and spread its roots. I ran across something that I find kind of fascinating. There was one of the New York newspapers is doing a preview of the Fashion Course series, the All-Star series between Brooklyn and New York that took place in the summer of 1858. And the New York paper says, well, you know, Manhattan clubs are older. Brooklyn has the numbers. That's what they say. Now, we've heard some population statistics already, but let me repeat it. In 1858, New York City's population was about 800,000, Brooklyn 275. So in what sense does Brooklyn have the numbers? What they're talking about is the numbers of baseball players. It tells you something about how popular baseball became so quickly in Brooklyn. In the period 55 to 58, leading up to the Fashion Course series, Brooklyn baseball was playing catch up, and it caught up very quickly. Brooklyn soon had 4 top clubs that were competitive with the Knicks, Eagles, Gothams, and Empires, as well as the Unions of Mauritania. In the late 1850s, when the baseball world was largely limited to the New York City and Brooklyn metropolitan area, there was a rapid increase in crowds, interclub matches, and inter-city matches. And this led to an explosion in media coverage. It's a bit of a chicken and egg question. What came first, interclub matches or inter-city rivalries, or public and press interest? Whichever it was, this period, late 1850s, there's a dramatic increase in eggs and chickens. A milestone in baseball's journey toward modernity occurred in 1857. And when you look at the game stories of that year, you see a lot of new details about increasing crowds and the beginnings of fan behavior. And it's interesting that the year 1857 is the year Henry Chadwick would often say would make a good birth date for the sport of baseball. So what's going on in this period is that the character and size of the crowds is beginning to change. I'm just going to give a few examples. In 1857, according to the New York Atlas, Gotham versus Atlantic, quote, described as the great match of the season with an immense attendance. And this story offers advice to fans on how to avoid traffic problems. The game story in the Clipper said that the ferry boats to Elysian Fields are packed with spectators, and the game was packed with spectators infringing upon the playing field. I think we're talking about a real large crowd here, not a imaginary one. In 1857, October, the New York Clipper describes the Enterprise versus Excelsiors game, which is the all-Brooklyn game, had a disappointing turnout. There wasn't a very large crowd owing to the fact that the match was not made up until the day before. Well, that's kind of interesting. People were reading about games in the schedule. They were being scheduled, read about in the newspaper, and that would affect turnout. In 1858, there was a game between the Excelsiors and Eagles at Carroll Park in downtown Brooklyn, and the Daily Eagle said 3,000 people were there, and that must have caused a few problems because Carroll Park isn't very big. In 1858, the Excelsiors played the Knickerbockers at Carroll Park, and this is what the Eagle said: "The announcement of a passage at arms between two clubs such as these is always a rallying cry to hundreds and thousands of the citizens of New York and Brooklyn." So what we're seeing here that's new is hard numbers and estimates that are numerical. There's also signs that the spectators were beginning to become part of the event itself. Another game, Excelsior versus Putnam, estimated at 1,500 to 2,000 spectators. Eagle versus Excelsior, another game, 3,000. And then comes the Fashion Course series. Whoops. Excuse me. Right here. This game one of the Fashion Course series attracted a shockingly high number of spectators, as high perhaps as 10,000. There were different estimates. And as we know, this was the first time anyone paid an admission to watch a baseball game. Game two, the newspapers mentioned that tickets are sold in advance. This is a first. A newspaper account said that not fewer than 8,000 tremendous cheering spectators from Brooklyn were there. So what kind of crowd was it? There are a few little hints. I think it was largely made up of the general public who were curious. This game happened in Queens, not Brooklyn. Of course, the draw was the Brooklyn-New York City rivalry. It was in Queens because that's where horse tracks were by state law. They were restricted in where they could be built to try to limit gambling. The baseball, people playing in the baseball series had moved the game to the Fashion Course series simply because it had infrastructure and stands. So what indications are there about the character of the crowds at the Fashion Course series? And there's an anecdote that the New York Times quotes, which I think is very revealing. They talk about how the crowd behaved pretty well, but there was one guy they described as annoying people by yelling at the players. And I like to imagine that he was doing what modern fans do, maybe telling someone they were playing too shallow. They said that a woman got up and said to the guy in a loud voice, "Are you a ball player too?" And that was considered a terrible put down and shut the guy up. But it's an odd story if you look at it from the point of view of a modern baseball fan, because we all know the game really well and we all feel entitled to yell at the ball players. And nobody would shut us up by yelling, "Are you a ball player too?" I think what the story tells us is that the game was a curiosity and that the crowd was made up of people and without a lot of expertise. It would be as if somebody was yelling at Gary Kasparov in a chess match, and another spectator might say, "What do you know about chess?" So the Fashion Course series had a tremendous effect on baseball as entertainment. It caused a spike in public interest and in crowd size. Issues of crowd control and actual fan behavior appear much more regularly in the news. And there's no question that it's especially true when Brooklyn clubs are playing New York City clubs. Even though at some point Brooklyn interclub matches attract growing crowds. And the reason I think is that Brooklyn fans were beginning to identify with clubs from neighborhoods and discrete parts of Brooklyn. The Atlantics, for instance, represented the rank and file residents of what had been Brooklyn proper, not the Eastern District, which was added in 1854, where Greenpoint and Williamsburg are. The Eckfords were the darling of this neighborhood, which was a district of shipyards and related industries. In June of 1859, the Atlas reports that at Charter Oak versus Star game at Carroll Park, a large crowd had to be pushed back by the police. And then the fans really crashed the party at the Atlantics versus Excelsior series in 1860. That first game at Red Hook, you've seen there's a famous picture of it, and it's right here. The fun thing about this picture is you can see that there's no stands. These people are on the left and on the right are on rises in the ground. Most of them are standing at ground level, but in the distance, there's the Brooklyn Yacht Club on the Gowanus. And look at all the people on the roofs and the top of the buildings, and even, according to newspapers, they were in the rigging of ships. This game drew a huge crowd, which apparently was fairly well behaved, but things went south in Game 3, the rubber match of the series in 1860. And if you know early baseball, you know that this game was a debacle. It was played between the Atlantics and Excelsiors, it was going to determine the championship of the season in all likelihood, and it was played at the Putnam's grounds because it was neutral. And what happened was in dispute. What you see here is all kinds of things that sound like modern fan behavior. The newspapers describe booing and cheering. The Atlantic fans booing the newspapers didn't like it, booing the umpire, booing the other side, heckling the umpire when he made a close call against the team. The Chadwick and the mainstream baseball journalists, it's interesting their reaction to it, which was they were shocked and scandalized. I mean, I actually don't believe they understood fan behavior the first time they saw it, because they say without much credibility that people behaving this way must have been disappointed bettors. And that's kind of interesting because they actually had trouble imagining why a person who had no personal relationship to either of the teams would care who won. And what we see as modern observers is simple, ordinary fan behavior. Now, in the 8th inning of that game, Joe Leggett took his team off the field because he was tired of the rowdy behavior by the fans. It's interesting that some of the newspaper accounts say things like rowdiness and violence, shameless behavior, but there's not one single allegation of a violent act. Nobody's throwing anything on the field or running out in the field. It seems to be mostly noise. So Leggett didn't like it and he left the field. And the press is sympathetic to Leggett and feels that the crowd behavior was provocative and justified him forfeiting the game. A couple weeks later, the secretary of the Atlantic Club, he writes a letter to the newspapers, and he says something that sounds kind of modern. He says that there's nothing wrong with the crowd behaving the way they do, then it's impossible to stop them because their passions are running high. Fans have raised the stakes and put more psychological pressure on players, and people like Leggett didn't like it. The Secretary Boughton of the Atlantic says, in effect, to the Excelsiors, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. This is the way baseball is now. Whoops, sorry about that. So this is a picture from 1865 of the Union Grounds, which was the first modern ballpark in the sense that it was completely enclosed and it regularly charged admission and had facilities for both spectators and players. This was run simply as a business and it always charged admission. In a few years, the trend toward enclosed ballparks spread beyond Brooklyn, but interestingly, not to the Elysian Fields. In the 1860s, the Mutuals built a stand for spectators there, but ultimately relocated to Brooklyn for economic reasons. Baseball was more profitable in Brooklyn for an obvious reason. That's where the fans were. Because baseball was played at the Elysian Fields never included fans, and there was no rivalry between New York and New York City, New Jersey and New York City, certainly nothing that could create fan interest. But the phenomenon of fans and rooting and paid admission spread to other places and to other rivalries. This is a game in Philadelphia in 1866. Now, what's interesting about this one is this is, of all the illustrations I've shown you, the closest to what you see at a modern ballpark. You will note, if you look very carefully at this picture, a better copy of it maybe, there are gamblers, there are bookies. There's a grandstand full of well-dressed women. There's a pickpocket right here in the lower left-hand corner. The guy in the white hat has just caught a pickpocket taking his watch. There are food vendors. There's a guy reading some kind of score sheet or sporting news. And most significantly of all, the baseball players are portraits of real people that we're supposed to recognize. They're actually numbered and their names are listed in the lower left-hand corner. The baseball players have achieved something like celebrity status. Fans, the presence of fans in numbers created new kinds of problems. a crowd of excited fans disrupted the '66 championship game between the Athletics and Athletics. And kind of fascinatingly, the clubs got into a bitter dispute over who should pay for fencing for crowd control. And even though fans in ballparks began to proliferate, Brooklyn remains ground zero for baseball fandom for many years. For instance, all the top Brooklyn clubs began playing at the Union grounds. Even into the National Association days, the Eckfords and Atlantics played there. As I mentioned, the Mutuals relocated to Brooklyn, playing there in the National League in 1876. Hartford comes to Brooklyn in 1877, the National League Hartford Club, all the way to Brooklyn to sell tickets. The sport of baseball was profoundly shaped by the advent of fans who were not invited to the party or even envisioned by the sport's amateur era founders. Beginning around the year 1857, fans crashed the party and we changed everything. Fans became part of the event. We brought money into baseball and ultimately created professional baseball in today's major leagues. Okay. Are there any questions?
I was just saying that Mother Nature's not cooperating with me over here.
Oh dear.
A couple of power surges in the house here, so I think I'm back.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. Yeah, there are a couple of comments and questions. So one question from Peter Gordon was, didn't Brooklyn also have more space than Manhattan, therefore could provide more places for clubs to play?
Well, that's why they went to New Jersey. Yeah, Lower Manhattan was running out of space.
Right.
There were plenty of places to play in Upper Island of Manhattan, like the Red House spot, and
Right.
You know, the Unions played the Bronx. So there were plenty of places to go other than Brooklyn.
Right. Okay. So there was room in Manhattan, in other words, but it was really.
But I mean, to the point that he's making, when those teams went to the Elysian Fields for that 10-year period, you didn't see the development of ballparks, fans, paid admission. And it's interesting to wonder why. And I think if you could, it's because there's nobody there who can identify with one of these clubs. You know, maybe if there was a New York club that represented a neighborhood and they were playing somewhere where people in that neighborhood had access, perhaps it could have happened. But the Elysian Fields is sort of a bubble. And there's no Newark team that's as good as the New York teams that's playing to attract local interest. So in a way, it's like a country club sport. It exists in a sort of hothouse. The clubs are playing for themselves, representing nobody, and there's no real chance for that to happen. Not, you know, there are other factors. The Stevens family wasn't interested in sports as entertainment.
Okay, Bruce Alderas asks, what is the origin of the word fan as applied to sports crowds? Now, I've gotten a couple of different versions of this over time.
Yeah, you know, one of my first jobs when I was working in publishing was editing etymologies. And I learned something, which is anything people think is the first, which is a corollary to finding the origin, right, of an expression or word, they're almost always by definition wrong and unprovable. So I always get nervous when I have to express an opinion about where something started, because new information tends to turn up. But I've heard people say that it's a short for the word fanatic. And other explanations like the fancy, which was a euphemism for gamblers. But it's possible that it's something completely different.
Yeah, Peter Morris, back in an early SABR convention that I attended, Peter, I think, received the best research presentation award there that day, having to do with the origins of the word fan. And he showed this back and forth going on. Sometimes somebody saying it had to do with fanatic, but at other times, what he found to be a little bit earlier than fanatic was this idea that it was someone who created a lot of wind by speaking. So I don't know if that's yeah, that was what Peter
Well,
Morris. So it's one of these situations. What we know so far.
yeah, and as I mentioned in my talk, the interesting thing is the phenomenon always precedes the term for it. And when we talk about Jim Creighton and curveball, the same issue is going to come up. How do you describe something you've never seen before?
Right.
And I think when Chadwick saw the passion of the crowds, he leapt to the conclusion that it was about gambling, and I'm very skeptical that was true. That there were 10,000 gamblers, including women, showing up in Queens.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question about that in a minute. Let me go down this list. So David Dyke makes a comment about one of the images you put up being the one in Philadelphia. It was, I think. And he said, this picture always drives me a bit nuts because the scale is so far off.
Yeah, it's not a wonderful piece of art.
Exactly. But there are some interesting things going on there, obviously, with the pickpocket and all.
Yeah, I think that says a lot.
Yeah, George Thompson always used to, find these little incidents of, pickpockets going on or other crimes at games and send them to me. He continues to say the land point is interesting as you follow right through to the 1980s, as you see fields overrun by development, with other public parks remaining, but new fields always popping up on the fringes. The trend went on for a century. So he's, I guess, in a sense, talking a little bit too about urban development.
Yeah, but there's no question that in New York, there's a lot of pressure, real estate pressure on open space.
Right.
And, if City Hall Park weren't next to City Hall and owned by the city, it would have been built a long time ago. It's very hard for us, even no matter a profitable sports business, to hold onto a piece of land in a place where real estate is so valuable.
Right.
But there's something else going on. Brooklyn's not just a place with open space. It's a place where teams are being attracted by the fact that they can make money there. Even in the late 19th century, there'd be postseason games that didn't involve Brooklyn teams that were played in Brooklyn. And what's happening is that, as with the Hartford team of 1877 and the Mutuals, they're going to where the money is. And Brooklyn, while not the largest, not by much smaller than Manhattan, but New York City at the time, it's much smaller. In 1858, it appears to have more baseball players and more baseball clubs, but it also has more fans. And there seems to be more interest and passion for the game.
LPC says, or questions, was a Crank a fan?
Sure, I think it means the same thing.
Yeah. That was,
on the point we were just discussing, an interesting daydream that I like to have is when you think about how important the Brooklyn-New York rivalry was to bring energy into baseball and really promoting it nationally because there's so much drama to it. Is that what Boston and Philadelphia were missing?
that could be.
Because if Camden had been Brooklyn, maybe town ball would have become the national sport. I think it's possible.
Maybe. I don't know. That debate could go on forever about, why was it the New York game? And, and of course, there's all kinds of, elements that come into that discussion, including the media, the press, so much of the national sporting press being kind of the Clipper and so forth being based in New York City.
Right.
My question I wanted to just ask you too was the importance of the fashion race course game, racehorse, game, racetrack game. Was the that was the first game to charge admission? Is that correct?
Yes, and it wasn't. They didn't charge admission to make money.
Right.
They did it
charity,
because
right?
what they did was they were using a horse racing track. This was done fairly short period of time, and they had to move it to there because they began to sense that this crowd was going to be bigger than the Elysian Fields could handle. So then the racetrack agrees to let them use the field, but they're on the grass portion of the racetrack and they're gonna do damage to it. I don't think they had any idea that many people would come. But they announced everyone has to kick in 10 cents, and it was a little more if you brought a vehicle to help repair the turf afterward. That was the purpose of it. And then they said any surplus would go to the Widows and Orphans Fund of the fire departments of the two cities.
Right.
And we know that it was
Well,
something like $71 left.
right. Okay. Corky Gaskell mentions, I have heard both fan and crank were more 1880s terms, which are kind of interesting. That's what he had heard.
Yeah, no, I've never actually done that much research into this one. I thought crank was earlier than fan, but I could be wrong. And crank comes from German, clearly, which means someone
okay.
who's sick. A hospital is a Krankenhaus.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. I think we'll be addressing, Ralph Carhart to everyone, I think we'll be addressing a bit of the question of why baseball beat out town ball in our panel, which is interesting.
Well, okay,
coming
that's
up
news
a
to
little
me.
later, but okay. All right, Tom, what can be said? Your book speaks for itself, really, and your knowledge of Brooklyn is it always amazes me. And maybe next year we'll be able to take in another game in St. George.
Sure, it will be my pleasure.
Mine will